Welcome back, friends. We are on part 2 of Ray Bradbury's Dandelion Wine, and I hope that as we get into this, it's helping you reminisce about fun memories of your childhood summers. I would love to hear about them in the comments. Let me know how you're liking it. Let's dive in. The town later in the day, and yet another harvest. Grandfather stood on the wide front porch like a captain surveying the vast, unmotioned calms of a season dead ahead. He questioned the wind and the untouchable sky, and the lawn on which stood Douglas and Tom to question only him. Grandpa, are they ready? Now? Grandfather pinched his chin. 500, 1,000, 2,000, easy. Yes, yes, a good supply. Pick 'em easy, pick 'em all. A dime for every sack delivered to the press. Hey! The boys bent, smiling. They picked the golden flowers, the flowers that flooded the world, dripped off lawns onto brick streets, tapped softly at crystal cellar windows, and agitated themselves so that on all sides lay the dazzle and glitter of molten sun. Every year, said Grandfather, they run amok. I let them, pride of lions in the yard, stare and they burn a hole in your retina. A common flower, a weed that no one sees, yes, but for us, a noble thing, the dandelion. So, plucked carefully in sacks, the dandelions were carried below. The cellar dark glowed with their arrival. The wine press stood open, cold. A rush of flowers warmed it. The press replaced it, screw rotated, twirled by Grandfather, squeezed gently on the crop. There. So. The golden tide, the essence of this fine fair month ran, then gushed from the spout below to be crocked, skimmed of ferment, and bottled in clean ketchup shakers, then rinked in sparkling rose in cellar gloom. Dandelion wine. The words were summer on the tongue. The wine was summer caught and stoppered. And now that Douglas knew, he really knew he was alive and moved, turning through the world so to touch and see it all, it was only right and proper that some of his new knowledge, some of this special vintage day would be sealed away for opening on a January day, with snow falling fast and the sun unseen for weeks or months, and perhaps some of the miracle by then forgotten and in need of renewal. Since this was going to be a summer of unguessed wonders, he wanted it all salvaged and labeled so that at any time he wished, he might tiptoe down into this dank twilight and reach up his fingertips. And there, row upon row, with the soft gleam of flowers opened at morning, with the light of this June sun glowing through a faint skin of dust, would stand the dandelion wine. Peer through it at the wintry day, the snow melted to grass, the trees were re-inhabited with bird, leaf, and blossoms, like a continent of butterflies breathing on the wind, and peering through color sky from iron to blue. Hold summer in your hand, pour summer in a glass tiny glass, of course, the smallest tingling sip for children. Change the season in your veins by raising glass to lip and tilting summer in. Ready now, the rain barrel. Nothing else in the world would do but the pure waters which had been summoned from the lakes far away, and the sweet fields of grassy dew on early morning, lifted to the open sky, carried in laundered clusters, 900 miles brushed with wind, electrified with high voltage, and condensed upon cool air. This water, falling, raining, gathered yet more of the heavens in its crystals, taking something of the east wind and the west wind and the north wind and the south. The water made rain, and the rain within this hour of rituals would be well on its way to wine. Douglas ran with the dipper. He plunged it deep into the rain barrel. Here we go. The water was silk in the cup, clear, faintly blue silk. It softened the lip and the throat and the heart if drunk. The water must be carried in dipper and buckets to the cellar, there to be leavened in freshets in mountain streams upon the dandelion harvest. Even Grandma, when snow was whirling fast, dizzying the world, blinding windows, stealing breath from gasping mouths, even Grandma, one day in February, would vanish to the cellar. Above, in the vast house, there would be coughings, sneezings, wheezings, and groans, childish fevers, throats raw as butcher's meat, noses like bottled cherries, the stealthy microbe everywhere. Then, rising from the cellar like a June goddess, Grandma would come, something hidden but obvious under her knitted shawl. This, carried to every miserable room upstairs and down, would be dispensed with aroma and clarity into neat glasses, to be swigged neatly. The medicines of another time, the balm of sun and idle August afternoons, the faintly heard sounds of ice wagons passing on brick avenues, the rush of silver rockets and the fountaining of lawnmowers moving through ant countries, all these in a glass. Yes, even Grandma, drawn to the cellar of winter for a June adventure, might stand alone and quietly, in secret conclave with her own soul and spirit, as did Grandfather and Father and Uncle Bert, or some of the boarders, communing with a last touch of a calendar long departed, with the picnics and the warm rains and the smell of fields of wheat and the new popcorn and bending hay. Even Grandma, repeating and repeating the fine and golden words, even as they were said now in this moment when the flowers were dropped into the press, as they would be repeated every winter for all the white winters in time, saying them over and over on the lips like a smile, like a sudden patch of sunlight in the dark. Dandelion wine, dandelion wine, dandelion wine. You did not hear them coming. You hardly heard them go. The grass bent down, sprang up again. They passed like cloud shadows downhill, the boys of summer running. Douglas, left behind, was lost. Panting, he stopped by the rim of the ravine at the edge of the softly blowing abyss. Here, ears pricked like a deer, he snuffed a danger that was old 1 billion years ago. Here the town divided, fell away in halves. Here civilization ceased. Here was only growing earth and 1,000,000 deaths and rebirths every hour. And here the paths, made or yet unmade, that told of the need of boys traveling, always traveling to be men. Douglas turned. The path led in a great dusty snake to the ice house where winter lived on the yellow days. This path raced for the blast furnace sands of the lake shore in July. This to trees where boys might grow like sour and still green crab apples hid among leaves. This one to peach orchard, grape arbor, watermelons, lying like tortoiseshell cats slumbered by sun. That path, abandoned but wildly swiveling to school. This, straight as an arrow, to Saturday cowboy matinees, and this, by the creek waters, to wilderness beyond town. Douglas squinted. Who could say where town or wilderness began? Who could say which owned what and what owned which? There was always and forever that indefinable place where the two struggled and one of them won for a season to possess a certain avenue, a dell, a glen, a tree, a bush, the thin lapping of the great continental sea of grass and flower, starting far out in lonely farm country, moved inward with the thrust of seasons. Each night the wilderness, the meadows, the far country flowed down creek through ravine water and welled up into town with the smell of grass, and the town was disinhabited and dead and gone back to earth. And each morning a little more of the ravine edged up into town, threatening to swamp garages like leaking rowboats, devour ancient cars which had been left to the flaking mercies of rain and therefore rust. Hey, hey! John Huff and Charlie Woodman ran through the mystery of ravine and town and time. Hey! Douglas moved slowly down the path. The ravine was indeed the place where you came to look at the two things of life, the ways of man and the ways of the natural world. The town was, after all, only a large ship filled with constantly moving survivors, bailing out the grass, chipping away the rust. Now and again a lifeboat, a shanty kin to the mother ship, lost out to the quiet storm of seasons, sank down in silent waves of termite and ant into swallowing ravine to fill the flicker of grasshoppers rattling like dry paper in hot weeds, become soundproofed in spider dust, and finally, in avalanche of shingle and tar, collapse like kindling shrines into a bonfire which thunderstorms ignited and blue lightning while flash photographing the triumph of the wilderness. It was this, then, the mystery of man seizing from the land and the land seizing back, year after year, that drew Douglas, knowing that towns never really won. They merely existed in calm peril, fully encountered with lawnmower, bug spray, and hedge shears, swimming steadily as long as civilization said to swim, but each house ready to sink in green tides, buried forever, when the last man ceased and his trowels and mower shattered to cereal flakes of rust. The town, the wilderness, the houses, the ravine. Douglas blinked back and forth, but how to relate the two, make sense of the interchange when his eyes moved down to the ground. The first rite of summer, the dandelion picking, the starting of the wine, was over. Now the second rite waited for him to make the motions, but he stood very still. Doug! Come on, Doug! The running voice faded. I'm alive, said Douglas. But what's the use? They're more alive than me. How come? How come? And standing alone, he knew the answer, staring down at his motionless feet. Late that night, going home from the show with his mother and father and his brother Tom, Douglas saw the tennis shoes in the bright store window. He glanced quickly away, but his ankles were seized, his feet suspended, then rushed. The earth spun, the shop awnings slammed their canvas wings overhead, with the thrust of his body running. His mother and father and brother walked quietly on both sides of him. Douglas walked backward, watching the tennis shoes in the midnight window left behind. It was a nice movie, said Mother. Douglas murmured, It was. It was June, and long past time for buying the special shoes that were quiet as a summer rain falling on the walks. June, and the earth full of raw power and everything everywhere in motion. The grass was still pouring in from the country, surrounding the sidewalks, stranding the houses. Any moment the town would capsize, go down, and leave not a stir in the clover and weeds. And here Douglas stood, trapped on the dead cement and the red brick streets, hardly able to move. Dad, he blurted out. Back there in that window, those cream sponge pair of Lightfoot shoes. His father didn't even turn. Suppose you tell me why you need a new pair of sneakers. Can you do that? Well, it was because they felt the way it feels every summer when you take off your shoes for the first time and you run in the grass. They felt like it feels sticking your feet out in the hot covers in wintertime to let the cold wind from the open window blow on them. And suddenly, you let them stay out a long time until you pull them back in under the covers again to feel them like packed snow. The tennis shoes felt like it always feels the first time every year, wading in the slow waters of the creek and seeing your feet below, half an inch further downstream with refraction than the real part of you above water. Dad, said Douglas, it's hard to explain. Somehow the people who made tennis shoes knew what boys needed and wanted. They put marshmallows and coiled springs in the soles, and they wove the rest out of grasses bleached and fired in the wilderness. Somewhere deep in the soft loam of the shoes, the thin, hard sinews of the buck deer were hidden. The people that made the shoes must have watched a lot of winds blow the trees and a lot of rivers going down to the lakes. Whatever it was in the shoes, and it was summer. Douglas tried to get all this in words. Yes, said Father, but what's wrong with last year's sneakers? Why can't you dig them out of the closet? Well, he felt sorry for boys who lived in California where they wore tennis shoes all year and never knew what it was like to get winter off your feet. peel off the iron leather shoes all full of snow and rain, and run barefoot for a day, and then lace on the first new tennis shoes of the season, which was better than barefoot. The magic was always in the new pair of shoes. The magic night might die by the 1st of September. But now in late June, there was still plenty of magic, and shoes like these could jump you over trees and rivers and houses, and if you wanted, they could jump you over fences and sidewalks and dogs. "Don't you see?" said Douglas. "I just can't use last year's pair." For last year's pair were dead inside. They had been fine when he started them out last year, but by the end of summer, every year, you always found out, you always knew, you couldn't really jump over rivers and trees and houses in them, and they were dead. But this was a new year, and he felt that this time, with this new pair of shoes, he could do anything, anything at all. They walked up on the steps to their house. "Save your money," said Dad. "In 5 or 6 weeks, summer'll be over." Lights out. With Tom asleep, Douglas lay watching his feet, far away down there at the end of the bed in the moonlight, free of the heavy iron shoes, the big chunks of winter fallen away from them. Reasons, I've got to think of reasons for the shoes. Well, as anyone knows, the hills around town were wild with friends putting cows to riot, playing barometer to the atmospheric changes, taking sun, peeling like calendars, each day to take more sun. To catch those friends, you must run much faster than foxes or squirrels. As for the town, it steamed with enemies, growing irritable with heat. So remembering every winter argument and insult, find friends, ditch enemies. That was the cream sponge para Lightfoot motto. Does the world run too fast? Want to catch up? Want to be alert? Stay alert? Lightfoot then, Lightfoot. He held his coin bank up and heard the faint small tinkling, the airy weight of money there. Whatever you want, he thought, you've got to make your own way. During the night now, let's find that path through the forest. Downtown, the store lights went out, one by one. A wind blew in the window. It was like a river going downstream, and his feet wanting to go with it. In his dreams, he heard a rabbit running in the deep, warm grass. Old Mr. Sanderson moved through his shoe store as the proprietor of a pet shop must move through his shop, where are kenneled animals from everywhere in the world, touching each one briefly along the way. Mr. Sanderson brushed his hands over the shoes in the window, and some of them were like cats to him, and some were like dogs. He touched each pair with concern, adjusting laces, fixing tongues. Then he stood in the exact center of the carpet and looked around, nodding. There was a sound of growing thunder. One moment, the door to Sanderson's shoe emporium was empty. The next, Douglas Spaulding stood clumsily there, staring down at his leather shoes as if these heavy things could not be pulled up out of the cement. The thunder had stopped when his shoes stopped. Now, with painful slowness, daring to look only at the money in his cupped hand, Douglas moved out of the bright sunlight of Saturday noon. He made careful stacks of nickels, dimes, and quarters on the counter, like someone playing chess and worried if the next move carried him out into sun or deep into shadow. "Don't say a word," said Mr. Sanderson. Douglas froze. "First, I know just what you want to buy," said Mr. Sanderson. "Second, I see you every afternoon at my window. You think I don't see you? You're wrong. Third, to give it its full name, you want the Royal Crown cream sponge para Lightfoot tennis shoes, like menthol on your feet. Fourth, you want credit." "No," cried Douglas, breathing hard, as if he had run all night in his dreams. "I got something better than credit to offer," he gasped. "Before I tell Mr. Sanderson, you've got to do me one small favor. Can you remember when the last time you yourself wore a pair of Lightfoot sneakers, sir?" Mr. Sanderson's face darkened. "Oh, 10, 20, say 30 years ago. Why?" "Mr. Sanderson, don't you think you owe it to your customers, sir, to at least try the tennis shoes you sell for just 1 minute, so you know how they feel? People forget if they don't keep testing things. United Cigar Store man smokes cigars, don't he? Candy store man samples his own stuff. I should think so. You may have noticed, said the old man, I'm wearing shoes. But not sneakers, sir. How are you going to sell sneakers unless you can rave about them? And how are you going to rave about them unless you know them? Mr. Sanderson backed off a little, made some distance from the boy's fever, one hand to his chin. Well, Mr. Sanderson, said Douglas, you sell me something, and I'll sell you something just as valuable. It is absolutely necessary to the sell that I put on a pair of the sneakers, boy, said the old man. I sure wish you could, sir. The old man sighed. A minute later, seated, panting quietly, he laced the tennis shoes to his long, narrow feet. They looked detached and alien down there next to the dark cuffs of his business suit. Mr. Sanderson stood up. How do they feel? Asked the boy. How do they feel? He asked. They feel fine. He started to sit down. Please, Douglas held out his hand. Mr. Sanderson, now could you kind of rock back and forth a little, sponge around, bounce kind of, while I tell you the rest? It's this. I give you my money. You give me the shoes. I owe you $1. But Mr. Sanderson, soon, as I get those shoes on, you know what happens? What? Bang! I deliver your packages, pick up packages, bring you coffee, burn your trash, run to the post office, telegraph office, library. You'll see 12 of me in and out, every minute. Feel those shoes, Mr. Sanderson. Feel how fast they'd take me. All those springs inside. Feel all the running inside. Feel how they kind of grab hold and can't let you alone and don't like you just standing there. Feel how quick I'd be doing the things you'd rather not bother with. You'd stay in the nice cool store while I'm jumping all around town. But it's not me, really. It's the shoes. They're going like mad down alleys, cutting corners and back. There they go. Mr. Sanderson stood amazed with the rush of words. When the words got going, the flow carried him. He began to sink deep in the shoes, to flex his toes, limber his arches, test his ankles. He rocked softly, secretly, back and forth in a small breeze from the open door. The tennis shoes silently hushed themselves in deep in the carpet, sank it as in a jungle grass, in loam and resilient clay. He gave one solemn bounce of his heels in the yeasty dough, in the yielding and welcoming earth. Emotions hurried over his face as if many colored lights had been switched on and off. His mouth hung slightly open. Slowly gently he rocked himself to a halt. And the boy's voice faded, and they stood there looking at each other in a tremendous and natural silence. A few people drifted by on the sidewalk outside in the hot sun. Still, the man and boy stood there, the boy glowing, the man with revelation in his face. Boy, said the old man at last, in 5 years, how would you like a job selling shoes in this emporium? Gosh, thanks, Mr. Sanderson, but I don't know what I'm going to be yet. Anything you want to be, son, said the old man. You'll be. No one will ever stop you. The old man walked lightly across the store to the wall of 10,000 boxes, came back with some shoes for the boy, and wrote up a list on some paper, while the boy was lacing the shoes on his feet and then standing there waiting. The old man held out his list. 12 things you've got to do for me this afternoon. Finish them. We're even Steven, and you're fired. Thanks, Mr. Sanderson. Douglas bounded away. Stop, cried the old man. Douglas pulled up and turned. Mr. Sanderson leaned forward. How do they feel? The boy looked down at his feet, deep in the rivers, in the fields of wheat, in the wind that already was rushing him out of the town. He looked up at the old man, his eyes burning, his mouth moving, but no sound came out. Antelopes, said the old man, looking from the boy's face to the shoes. Gazelles? The boy thought about it, hesitated, and nodded. A quick nod. Almost immediately he vanished. He just spun about with a whisper and went off. The door stood empty. The sound of the tennis shoes faded in the jungle heat. Mr. Sanderson stood in the sun-blazed door listening. From a long time ago, when he dreamed as a boy, he remembered the sound, beautiful creatures leaping under the sky, gone through brush, under trees, away, and only the soft echo, their running left behind. Antelopes, said Mr. Sanderson. Gazelles. He bent to pick up the boy's abandoned winter shoes, heavy with forgotten rains and long melted snow. Moving out of the blazing sun, walking softly, lightly, slowly, he headed back towards civilization. He brought out a yellow nickel tablet. He brought out a yellow Ticonderoga pencil. He opened the tablet. He licked the pencil. Tom, he said, you and your statistics gave me an idea. I'm going to do the same. Keep track of things. For instance, you realize that every summer we do things over and over we did the whole darn summer before? Like what, Doug? Well, like making dandelion wine, like buying these new tennis shoes, like shooting off the first firecracker of the year, like making lemonade, like getting slivers in our feet, like picking wild fox grapes. Every year, the same thing, same way, no change, no difference. That's one half of summer, Tom. What's the other half? Things we do for the first time ever. Like eating olives? Well, bigger than that. Like finding out maybe that Grandpa or Dad don't know everything in the world. They know every darn thing there is to know, and don't you forget it. Tom, don't argue. I already got it written down under discoveries and revelations. They don't know everything, but it's no crime. That I discovered too. What other new crazy stuff you got in there? I'm alive. Heck, that's old. Thinking about it, noticing it, it's new. You do things and you don't watch. Then all of a sudden you look and see what you're doing, and it's the first time. Really? I'm going to divide this summer up in 2 parts. First part of this tablet is titled Rites and Ceremonies. The first root beer pop of the year. The first time running barefoot in the grass of the year. First time almost drowning in the lake of the year. First watermelon, first mosquito, first harvest of dandelions. Those are the things we do over and over and over and never think. Now here and back, like I said, is discoveries and revelations, or maybe illuminations. That's a swell word. Or intuitions, okay? In other words, you do an old familiar thing like bottling dandelion wine, and you put that under rites and ceremonies. And then you think about it, and what you think, crazy or not, you put under discoveries and revelations. Here's what I got on the wine. Every time you bottle it, you get a whole chunk of 1928 put away safe. How you like that, Tom? I got lost a mile back somewhere. Well, let me show you another. Up front, under ceremonies, I got First Argument and Licking of Summer 1928 by Dad, morning of June 24th. In back, under Revelations, I got The reason why grown-ups and kids fight is because they belong to separate races. Look at them, different from us. Look at us, different from them. Separate races, and never the twain shall meet. Put that in your pipe and smoke it, Tom. Doug, you hit it. You hit it. That's right. That's exactly why we don't get along with Mom or Dad. Trouble from sunrise to supper. Boy, you're a genius. Anytime this next 3 months you see something done over and over, tell me. Think about it and tell me that. Come Labor Day, we'll add up the summer and see what we got. I got a statistic for you right now. Grab your pencil, Doug. There are 5 billion trees in the world. I looked it up. Under every tree is a shadow, right? So then what makes night? I'll tell you. Shadows crawling out from under 5 billion trees. Think of it. Shadows running around in the air, muddying the waters, you might say. If only we could figure a way to keep those darn 5 billion shadows under those trees, we could stay up half the night, Doug, because there'd be no night. There you are, something old, something new. That's old and new, all right. Douglas licked the yellow Ticonderoga pencil, whose name he dearly loved. Say it again. Shadows are under 5 billion trees. Yes, summer was rituals, each with its natural time and place. The ritual of lemonade or iced tea making, the ritual of wine, shoes or no shoes, and at last swiftly following the others with quiet dignity, the ritual of the front porch swing. On the third day of summer, in the late afternoon, Grandfather reappeared from the front door to gaze serenely at the 2 empty eye rings in the ceiling of the porch. Moving to the geranium pot-lined rail like Ahab, surveying the mild day and mild-looking sky, he wet his finger to test the wind and shucked his coat to see how shirt sleeves felt in the westering hours. He acknowledged the salutes of other captains on yet other flowered porches, out themselves to discern the gentle ground swelling of weather, oblivious to their wives chirping or snapping like fuzzball hand dogs hidden behind back porch screens. All right, Douglas, let's set it up. In the garage, they found, dusted, and carried forth the howdad, as it were, for the quiet summer night festivals, the swing chair which Grandpa chained to the porch ceiling eyelets. Douglas, being lighter, was first to sit in the swing. Then, after a moment, Grandfather gingerly settled his pontifical weight beside the boy. Thus they sat, smiling at each other, nodding as they swung silently back and forth, back and forth. 10 minutes later, Grandma appeared with water buckets and brooms to wash down and sweep off the porch. Other chairs, rockers, and straightbacks were summoned from the house. Always like to start sitting early in the season, said Grandpa, before the mosquitoes thicken. About 7 o'clock, you could hear the chairs scraping back from the tables, someone experimenting with a yellow-toothed piano. If you stood outside the dining room window and listened, matches being struck, the first dishes bubbling in the suds and tinkling on the wall racks, somewhere, faintly, a phonograph playing. And then, as the evening changed the hour, at house after house on the twilight streets, under the immense oak and elms, on shady porches, people would begin to appear, like those figures who tell good or bad weather in rain or shine clocks. Uncle Bert, perhaps, Grandfather, then Father, and some of the cousins, the men, all coming out first into this syrupy evening, blowing smoke, leaving the women's voices behind in the cooling, warm kitchen to set their universe aright. Then the first male voices under the porch brim, the feet up, the boys fringed on the worn steps or wooden rails, where sometimes during the evening something, a boy or a geranium, would fall off. At last, like ghosts hovering momentarily behind the door screen, Grandma, Great-Grandma, and Mother would appear, and the men would shift, move, and offer seats. The women carried varieties of fans with them, folded newspapers, bamboo, whisks, or perfumed kerchiefs to start the air moving about their faces as they talked. When they talked of all evening long, what they talked of all evening long, no one remembered next day. It wasn't important to anyone what the adults talked about. It was only important that the sounds came and went over the delicate ferns that bordered the porch on 3 sides. It was only important that the darkness filled the town like black water being poured over the houses, and that the cigars glowed and that the conversations went on and on. The female gossip moved out, disturbing the first mosquitoes, so they danced in frenzies on the air. The male voices invaded the old house timbers. If you close your eyes and put your head down against the floorboards, you could hear the men's voices rumbling like a distant political earthquake, constant, unceasing, rising or falling a pitch. Douglas sprawled back on the dry porch planks, completely contented and reassured by these voices, which would speak on through eternity, flow in a stream of murmurings over his body, over his closed eyelids, into his drowsy ears for all time. Like the rocking chairs sounded like crickets, and crickets sounded like rocking chairs. And the moss-covered rain barrel by the dining room window produced another generation of mosquitoes to provide a topic of conversation through endless summers ahead. Sitting on the summer night porch was so good, so easy, and so reassuring that it could never be done away with. These were rituals that were right and lasting, the lasting of pipes, the pale hands that moved knitting needles in the dimness, the eating of foil-wrapped chilled Eskimo pies, the coming and going of all the people. For at some time or other during the evening, everyone visited here. The neighbors down the way, the people across the street, Miss Fern and Miss Roberta humming by in their electric runabout, giving Tom or Douglas a ride around the block and then coming up to sit down and fan away the fever in their cheeks, or Mr. Jonas, the junk man, having left his horse and wagon hidden in the alley and ripe to bursting with words, would come up the steps looking as fresh as if talk had never been said before, and somehow it never had. And last of all, the children who had been off squinting their way through a last hide and seek or kick the can, panting, glowing, would sickle quietly back like boomerangs along the soundless lawn to sink beneath the tallest talking of the porch voices, which would weigh and gentle them down. Oh, the luxury of lying in the fern night and the grass night and the night of susurrant, slumberous voices weaving the dark together. The grown-ups had forgotten he was there. So still, so quiet Douglas lay, noting the plans they were making for his and their own futures. And the voices chanted, drifted in moonlight, clouds of cigarette smoke, while the moths lay like late apple blossoms come alive, tapped faintly above the far street lights, and the voices moved on into the coming years. Have you ever had times like that? I remember being at my grandparents', and neighbors came over to visit, and sometimes as a kid you would think, will this ever end? Or you would even fall asleep listening to their voices. But seeing it through Douglas's eyes and reminiscing, those were such beautiful times. I hope you are enjoying the book through Douglas's perspective of summer on these hot summer days as we are reading it. I hope you will leave a comment. Let me know what you're thinking, and if you've picked up the book yourself to follow along. We'll see you again next week.